Jensen Huang built a company worth $3 trillion and still schedules every meeting himself to protect his thinking time. Welcome to Whispering Pages. If you're here just for the summary, skip to the next chapter. For the rest of us, let's ease in. Notice the sounds around you, the room's quiet hum, the weight of your body where it rests. Let that hold you. The brain in its pre-sleep state holds ideas differently. What settles in tonight tends to stay. Tonight's book is The Thinking Machine by Stephen Witt, published in 2025. It's the story of Jensen Huang, Nvidia, and how a gaming chip company accidentally became the engine of the AI revolution. So let's begin. Get comfortable. Close your eyes if you'd like. And let's whisper through this one together. In 1993, 3 engineers sat in a Denny's restaurant in San Jose, California, and decided to start a company. They had $200 between them, Jensen Huang's contribution, pulled from his wallet, and an idea that most people in Silicon Valley would have called premature at best, delusional at worst. They wanted to build a chip that could generate 3-dimensional graphics fast enough to make video games feel real. 30 years later, that company would be worth more than $3 trillion. And the man who had reached into his wallet that afternoon would become one of the wealthiest people on Earth. This is the story The Thinking Machine tells. Stephen Witt spent years reporting it, and the result is a vivid, deeply researched account of how Nvidia went from a gaming chip startup to the company that powers artificial intelligence. It's a business story, yes. But at its heart, it's a story about one man, Jensen Huang, and the particular kind of obsession it takes to hold a company together through 30 years of near misses, technical bets, and moments when the whole thing came within a few weeks of ending. Huang grew up in Taiwan, born in 1963. When he was 5, his family moved to Thailand. When he was 10, his parents sent him to boarding school in the United States, alone. He landed at Oneida Baptist Institute in rural Kentucky, a school that mixed academic instruction with manual labor. Huang cleaned toilets. He shared a room with a teenager who kept a hunting knife under his pillow. He was a long way from home, and there was no coming back. His parents had placed a bet on America, and Jensen was the vehicle through which that bet would be settled. What's striking about Witt's telling is how these early years shaped everything that followed. Huang didn't just survive Oneida, he became someone who understood hardship as preparation. He discovered table tennis, trained obsessively, and eventually became nationally ranked. That same intensity followed him to Oregon, where his family eventually settled, and then to Oregon State University. In an electrical engineering lab, he met a student named Lori Mills. They studied together. They married. She became the quiet anchor to a life that would soon become anything but quiet. After graduating, Huang took a job at the semiconductor company AMD, then moved to LSI Logic, a chip design firm where he met 2 engineers who would change his life, Krizhevsky and Priem. The 3 of them saw something their employers didn't. Graphics processing was about to matter enormously. Personal computers were getting fast enough to run real-time 3-dimensional rendering, and whoever figured out how to build the right chip at the right moment would own a market that barely existed yet. So they left. And that Denny's meeting in 1993, which Witt reconstructs in careful detail, became the founding of Nvidia. The early years were brutal. Their first chip, the NV1, was a disaster. Nvidia had bet on a particular technical approach called quadratic texture mapping, which turned out to be the wrong standard. The industry moved a different direction, and Nvidia's product was suddenly incompatible with the games developers were actually making. Sales collapsed. The company burned through cash. There were moments when the payroll account was nearly empty and the team genuinely did not know if the next week would be their last. Huang responded to these moments in a way that became a defining pattern. He kept the pressure on without letting it become panic. He imposed deadlines that other engineers thought were impossible. He pushed people to identify the fastest conceivable path forward and then assumed they could do it in half the time. The second chip, the NV3, later called the Riva 128, went from concept to shipping product in roughly 6 months. At the time, that was almost unheard of. They used a hardware emulator instead of building physical prototypes, which saved months. It worked. The Riva landed in stores in 1997, and for the first time, Nvidia had something people actually wanted. The company went public in 1999 at a valuation of $600 million. Huang coined the term GPU, Graphics Processing Unit, to describe what they were building, and that term stuck. But the real story of Nvidia isn't the gaming business. It's what came next, and how it almost didn't happen. Around 2003, an engineer named John Nichols walked into Huang's office and told him something unsettling. Moore's Law, the principle that computing power doubles roughly every 2 years as transistors get smaller, was about to run into a physical wall. The chips were approaching atomic scale. Dennard scaling, which kept chips fast without making them hot, was also breaking down. Within a few years, the raw speed of individual processors would plateau. This was a problem for the entire industry. But Nichols thought he saw a solution, and that solution was Nvidia's chip. A graphics processing unit, by its nature, is built differently from a central processing unit. A CPU is designed to handle a few complex tasks very quickly, in sequence. A GPU is designed to handle millions of simpler tasks simultaneously, because that's what rendering graphics requires. Every pixel on a screen needs to be calculated, and there are a lot of pixels. The GPU's strength is parallelism, doing many things at once. Nichols argued that this architecture, originally built to move images, could be repurposed to move data through scientific calculations, chemistry simulations, weather modeling, fluid dynamics. Any problem that could be broken into parallel streams could, in theory, run faster on a GPU than on anything else. Huang listened. And then he made a decision that, in hindsight, looks like one of the most consequential bets in the history of computing. He committed Nvidia to building CUDA, Compute Unified Device Architecture, a software platform that would allow programmers to run general computations on Nvidia's graphics chips. It took years, cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and required convincing a deeply skeptical engineering team that it was worth doing. For a long time, almost no one used it. The first version launched around 2006. Downloads were minimal. Researchers were curious but uncertain. Wall Street was hostile. Activist investors circled. In 2013, a hedge fund called Starboard Value, known for pressuring companies into selling themselves or changing leadership, quietly accumulated a stake in Nvidia. They had a list of concerns. The gaming business was under pressure. CUDA hadn't generated meaningful revenue. Huang's habit of pursuing what he called $0 billion markets, opportunities so early stage that no revenue yet existed, looked, to outside observers, like expensive distraction. There were quiet conversations at the board level about whether Huang should remain as chief executive. He survived. But only barely. And what saved him wasn't a pivot. It was a graduate student in Toronto who had been training a neural network in his bedroom. Alex Krizhevsky was working toward his doctorate at the University of Toronto, studying under Geoffrey Hinton, one of the pioneers of deep learning, a branch of artificial intelligence that attempts to teach computers to recognize patterns by exposing them to enormous amounts of data. In 2012, Krizhevsky entered a computer vision competition called ImageNet, which challenged teams to correctly identify objects in 15 million photographs. He trained his neural network, a model he called AlexNet, on 2 gaming graphics cards that cost about $500 each. The cards were Nvidia GeForce GTX 580s. He ran the training for a week. When the results came in, AlexNet had achieved roughly 80% accuracy on the ImageNet test set. The previous best, for models running on traditional hardware, was around 70%. The gap wasn't subtle. It was the kind of gap that makes everyone in a field stop and reconsider their assumptions. Researchers who had spent careers doubting deep learning suddenly began converting. And the common thread in every conversation that followed was Nvidia's chip. Google noticed. Within months, they acquired Krizhevsky and his teammates, including Ilya Sutskever and Geoffrey Hinton himself, for $44 million. It was a signal that the AI race had begun in earnest, and that Nvidia's hardware was what it would run on. Here's something worth pausing on, because it explains a lot about how Nvidia became what it became. Between 2012 and 2022, the speed at which Nvidia's chips could perform AI inference, the process of running a trained model to generate answers, improved by roughly 1,000 times. Only about 2.5 times of that improvement came from building smaller transistors. The other 400 times came from software. From better algorithms, more efficient data movement, and the deep integration between Nvidia's hardware and the tools that researchers use to build AI systems. This is the part of the story that often gets lost. Nvidia's competitive advantage isn't just that they make powerful chips. It's that they've spent decades building software, CUDA, and now hundreds of specialized toolkits that makes those chips dramatically easier and faster to use for AI work. Switching from Nvidia to a competitor isn't just a hardware swap. It means rebuilding your entire software stack. Most organizations, once committed to CUDA, don't leave. Huang understood this dynamic intuitively, long before it became obvious to anyone else. He hired over 10,000 software engineers, unusual for what most people still thought of as a chip company. He gave away the toolkits for free. The strategy was lock in through usefulness, make Nvidia's platform so deeply embedded in how AI research works that alternatives become invisible. In 2016, Nvidia shipped the DGX-1, its first purpose-built AI supercomputer. Price tag, $129,000. The first unit went to Elon Musk, who was then helping fund OpenAI, the non-profit artificial intelligence lab he'd co-founded with Sam Altman a year earlier. Musk had it delivered to the OpenAI office in San Francisco. The lab used it to begin training language models that could generate text, answer questions, and eventually hold conversations. OpenAI was founded in 2015 with a mission that now reads as almost quaint: to develop artificial general intelligence for the benefit of humanity, and to share the results openly. The founding team included Musk, Altman, Sutskever, who had come over from Google after the AlexNet acquisition, and several others who had been watching the deep learning wave build from various perches in the research community. Sutskever, after joining OpenAI, encountered a paper that had just emerged from Google. It was called Attention Is All You Need, and it described a new architecture for neural networks called the transformer. The core idea, a mechanism called self-attention, allowed models to understand the relationships between words across an entire document at once, rather than processing them sequentially. A small team of 8 researchers at Google had written it over the course of a year, often working nights and weekends around their main assignments. The transformer turned out to be the breakthrough that made large language models possible. It was the architecture behind GPT, the model series that OpenAI would use to eventually build ChatGPT. And it ran on Nvidia GPUs. OpenAI's first GPT model, in 2018, had 100 million parameters, the internal numerical weights that determine how a model responds to inputs. By 2019, GPT-2 had 1.5 billion. By 2020, GPT-3 had cleared 100 billion, and the training cost had crossed $100 million. Each generation required more GPU time, more Nvidia hardware, more spending on chips that only one company was really positioned to supply at scale. In November 2022, OpenAI released ChatGPT to the public. Within 2 months, it had 100 million users, the fastest any consumer application had ever reached that milestone. The conversations it could hold, the essays it could write, the code it could generate, it felt, to most people who encountered it, like something genuinely new. A machine that understood language. A thinking machine. And the hardware underneath it, the chips running billions of operations per second to generate each response, came overwhelmingly from a company that had started in a Denny's with $200 and a bet on video games. Witt spends considerable time inside the mechanics of how Huang runs Nvidia, and this is among the most fascinating parts of the book, because the management approach is genuinely strange and genuinely seems to work. Nvidia has no chief operating officer, no chief technology officer, no chief marketing officer. Huang instead maintains a flat structure in which more than 30 executives report directly to him. Most companies would call this unmanageable. Huang calls it clarity. His reasoning: if there's no layer between him and the people actually doing the work, information moves faster and decisions get made with fewer distortions. He participates in a weekly reporting ritual with his entire organization. Every employee, all 50,000 of them, submits their 5 current priorities by email every Friday. Huang doesn't read all of them, but he samples randomly and regularly. The effect is that no one knows when the chief executive might be looking at their list. People stay sharp. They also know that if something's going wrong, a project stalling, a decision getting stuck, it might surface directly. He schedules his own meetings. Not an assistant, not a chief of staff, Huang. He believes that the calendar is the truest expression of what a leader values, and he isn't willing to delegate that expression to anyone else. Every hour he gives to one thing is an hour taken from something else, and he wants to be the person making that call. He runs what insiders describe as public teaching sessions, moments in company meetings where a failure is examined openly, in front of the team. Employees who've experienced these describe them as uncomfortable but clarifying. The failure is examined, the lesson extracted, and then it's over. No lasting punishment. No grudge. Just the extraction of learning from the wreckage of a mistake. The phrase he returned to most often, written on a whiteboard in the difficult year of 2013 when activist investors were threatening his job, was an abbreviation, OILO. Once in a lifetime opportunity. It was his way of reframing the crisis. Yes, the business was struggling. Yes, the market didn't understand CUDA yet. But the window that was opening, AI, parallel computing, the end of the era where the CPU alone could handle everything, that window would not stay open forever. He wanted everyone around him to feel the urgency without succumbing to the panic. The financial story that followed is almost impossible to describe without sounding like exaggeration. In May 2023, Nvidia's value increased by $200 billion in a single day, more than the total market value of most large corporations, after the company issued earnings guidance that confirmed the AI boom was real and that Nvidia would be its primary hardware supplier. By 2024, the company's valuation had crossed $3 trillion, briefly making it the most valuable company on Earth. Huang's personal stake was worth over $100 billion. But Witt doesn't let the numbers do the storytelling. He keeps returning to the people who built it and the people who missed it. Priem, one of the 3 co-founders from that Denny's meeting, is perhaps the most striking example. Priem was gradually pushed to the margins as Nvidia grew, his role narrowing, his influence fading. He sold all of his shares between 2004 and 2006, when Nvidia's stock was a fraction of what it would eventually become. Those shares, had he held them, would be worth roughly $100 billion today. Instead, he took his proceeds and donated $500 million to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, his alma mater. He built a laboratory. He funded scholarships. He became, in his own way, a philanthropist of considerable impact, just not a billionaire. Krizhevsky, whose AlexNet paper arguably lit the fuse on everything that followed, walked away from the AI field entirely after collecting a modest payout from Google. By the time Witt found him, he was living above a Vietnamese restaurant, pursuing a quiet life that had nothing to do with the industry his work had transformed. The irony is sharp. The man whose bedroom experiment helped create trillion-dollar fortunes for others wanted no part of the game. Let's be honest about where the thinking machine has its limits, because understanding them helps you get the most out of it. This is, first and foremost, a book about Jensen Huang. That means we see the company largely through his decisions, his presence, and his personality. The engineers who built CUDA, the researchers who developed the software toolkits, the teams that negotiated the supply chain deals, they appear, but often briefly, and mostly in service of the larger arc. For a company whose real competitive advantage is its software engineering culture, that's a meaningful gap. You finish the book understanding Huang deeply, and the organization at a somewhat higher altitude. There's also the question of access. Witt had significant access to Huang, and the book reflects that. We get vivid scenes, dinners, meetings, factory floors, that feel intimate and well observed. But proximity to a subject can shape a narrative in subtle ways. Huang emerges as sympathetic even in his most demanding moments. The employees who were publicly corrected in those teaching sessions mostly describe the experience as valuable, in hindsight. That may be true. It's also the kind of thing people say when they still work for the person who corrected them. The book also moves quickly through some of the ethical complexities of what Nvidia has built. The AI systems running on Nvidia hardware generate images, write code, draft legal documents, and increasingly make decisions that affect people's lives. The questions this raises, about labor displacement, about the accuracy of AI outputs, about who controls the systems and for whose benefit, are enormous and genuinely difficult. Witt acknowledges them but doesn't dwell. His focus is on how the technology was built, not on what it might do to us. On the existential risk question, Huang dismisses it. He said, in various forums, that worrying about superintelligence is premature. He sees AI as a tool, powerful, yes, but ultimately something humans operate and direct. Others who've been closer to the technology, Jeffrey Hinton, Ilya Sutskever, Elon Musk, have been considerably less reassured. Witt documents the disagreement without fully resolving it, which is probably the honest choice. Who is this book not for? If you're looking for a technical deep dive into how GPUs work, or a thorough exploration of AI ethics, or a management framework you can apply directly, this isn't quite that. It's a narrative biography, not a manual. It's designed to be experienced, not extracted from. But here's what it does extraordinarily well. It makes the stakes of this particular technological moment feel real and human. The AI revolution isn't an abstraction. It grew from specific decisions made by specific people. A boarding school student who learned to survive by becoming relentless. 2 engineers who shared his vision in a Denny's. A grad student who trained a neural network in a bedroom. It ran on chips that were designed, originally, so that teenagers could play video games that looked convincing. The thinking machine at the center of this story isn't just the AI. It's Jensen Huang. And understanding how he thinks, the obsession with speed, the insistence on seeing around corners, the refusal to accept that something couldn't be done faster, may be as close as we can get to understanding how one man's mind quietly rebuilt the architecture of the modern world. There's much more in the full book: the failed AI acquisition, the cryptocurrency boom and its aftermath, the manufacturing partnership with TSMC, and the fuller portraits of the engineers and researchers who shaped the company from the inside, that deserve your time. The link to grab a copy is below, and it helps support the channel at no extra cost to you. Sleep well. Let these ideas settle in. And we'll see you at Whispering Pages for the next one.